Massey Ferguson couldn't get parts for 11 days. His neighbor's John Deere finished the field. The two farms sat side by side along County Road 47 in eastern Nebraska, just outside the town of Lyons. Same soil composition, same drainage patterns, same climate zone, same 1,800 acres under cultivation. The only meaningful difference was the color of the equipment. On the north side of the road, Rick Vandenberg ran a John Deere operation. 4 8R tractors, 2 S-Series combines, a dealership relationship that stretched back 22 years. On the south side, Matt Caruso had recently converted his entire fleet to Massey Ferguson. 3 8S265 tractors, 1 8S305, an ideal 9T combine. He'd made the switch 18 months earlier after running detailed cost comparisons that showed the Massey Fergusons could save him $38,000 annually in fuel and maintenance costs compared to equivalent John Deere models. The two men weren't close friends, but they weren't enemies either. They'd helped each other out over the years, borrowed equipment during breakdowns, shared labor during critical windows, traded information about seed varieties and chemical applications. But there was always an undercurrent of competition, not hostile, just present. Because in agriculture, when two operations run identical land under identical conditions, performance becomes measurable, comparable, and nobody wants to be the guy who falls behind. Spring 2025 started well for both farms. April brought good moisture, early soil temps were favorable, and by the first week of May, both operations were geared up for soybean planting. Matt had his Massey Ferguson 8S265 set up with a 24-row planter running Asgrow seeds. Rick had his John Deere 8R340 pulling a similar configuration. The plan was simple: 10 days of solid planting weather, get the beans in the ground, move on to pre-emergent applications. Standard operating procedure for both farms. Matt started on May 6th. The 8S265 ran beautifully. The Dyna-VT transmission handled the planter load without hesitation. Cab comfort was excellent. Fuel consumption was tracking at 6.4 gallons per hour, which was exactly where Matt expected it. He covered 340 acres the first day, another 380 the second day. By May 8th, he was over 40% planted and ahead of schedule. Rick started a day later due to a minor planter calibration issue, but by May 9th, he was running hard and making up ground. The two operations were neck and neck. Then on May 10th at 2:17 in the afternoon, Matt's 8S265 threw a fault code. The tractor was mid-pass in the northeast section when the transmission suddenly shifted into neutral and refused to re-engage. Matt pulled up the diagnostic screen on the cab display. Error code P0720, output speed sensor malfunction. The tractor wasn't going anywhere until the sensor was replaced. Matt shut down the machine and called his operator over from the grain cart tractor. They ran a visual inspection. No obvious damage, no leaks, no broken wiring. It was an electronic failure. A sensor had gone bad. It happened. It wasn't a design flaw. It wasn't negligence. It was just one of those components that fails after a few hundred hours of use. Matt had 1,240 hours on the tractor. The sensor was a wear item. Replacing it should have been routine. He called the Massey Ferguson dealer in Fremont, explained the situation, gave them the error code and the tractor's serial number. The parts guy put him on hold for 3 minutes and came back with bad news. They didn't have the sensor in stock. The part number was 4381756M1. It was a common component, but their inventory had been depleted the previous week during a regional service push. They could order it from the regional warehouse in Omaha. Should be in by tomorrow afternoon, maybe the next morning at the latest. Matt wasn't thrilled, but he wasn't panicked either. A day or two of downtime during planting wasn't ideal, but it wasn't catastrophic. He had other equipment. He could pull one of the 8S265s off secondary tillage duty and swap it onto the planter. He'd lose some efficiency, but he'd keep moving. He thanked the parts guy and hung up. 20 minutes later, the dealer called back. The regional warehouse in Omaha was also out of stock. The part was backordered. The next shipment was coming from a distribution center in Belton, Missouri. ETA was 3 to 5 business days. Maybe sooner if they could expedite shipping, but no guarantees. Matt felt the first edge of concern. 3 to 5 days meant he'd be down until at least May 13th. possibly May 15th. That was half his planting window. He asked if there were any other warehouses that might have the part. The dealer said they'd check. Put him on hold again. Came back 10 minutes later and said they'd found one sensor at a parts depot in Kansas. They were trying to coordinate a transfer. Should have an update by end of day. Matt hung up and stood in the field next to his dead tractor. Across the road, he could see Rick's John Deere 8R340 working steadily through a neighboring section. Green and yellow paint moving in clean rows. Planting, making progress, exactly what Matt should have been doing. By 6 p.m., the dealer called again. The Kansas depot had confirmed they had the sensor, but it couldn't ship until the next morning. And because of carrier routing schedules, it wouldn't arrive in Fremont until May 13th at the earliest. 4 days. Matt asked if he could drive down to Kansas and pick it up himself. The dealer said the depot didn't allow customer pickups. It was a distribution facility, not a retail counter. The part had to go through normal shipping channels. Matt thanked him and ended the call. Then he sat in his truck and did the math. 4 days minimum, possibly 5. That was 600 acres he wouldn't get planted on schedule. If weather turned, if rain moved in, he could miss the entire optimal window. And unlike a lot of mechanical failures, this one didn't have a workaround. You couldn't bypass a transmission sensor. You couldn't rig a temporary fix. The tractor was completely immobilized until the part arrived. That night, Matt called Rick, not to ask for help, just to vent. Rick listened and then said something Matt wasn't expecting. He said, "Funny you mentioned that, because I had the exact same failure 2 days ago. My 8R threw a speed sensor fault on May 8th. I called the dealer that afternoon. They had the part in stock. I drove over, picked it up, and had it installed by 9 a.m. the next morning. Total downtime was 16 hours. Matt didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he asked what the part cost. Rick said $310. Same sensor, same failure. But because Rick's dealership kept adequate inventory and because John Deere's parts distribution network prioritized high-demand components, he'd been back in the field before Matt even knew his tractor was broken. Matt hung up and sat at his kitchen table staring at nothing. It wasn't Rick's fault. It wasn't even the Massey Ferguson dealer's fault, really. It was a supply chain issue, a logistics gap. The kind of thing that happens when you're running equipment from a brand that doesn't have the same parts infrastructure as the market leader. But knowing that didn't make it easier to accept. Because while Matt sat waiting for a $340 sensor to ship from Missouri, Rick was planting. Every hour, every day, pulling further ahead. May 11th came and went. No update from the dealer. May 12th, same thing. Matt spent both days running his backup 8S265 on the planter, but the setup wasn't optimized. The tractor had been configured for tillage work, not planting, and the hydraulic flow rates were slightly off. Planting speed dropped by 12%. Seed spacing consistency suffered. It wasn't a disaster, but it was sloppy. And Matt knew it. On May 13th, the dealer called. The part had shipped from Missouri on schedule, but the carrier had missed a connection in Des Moines. New delivery estimate was May 15th. Maybe May 16th if there were further delays. Matt asked if they could arrange for expedited shipping. The dealer said the part was already in transit. Once it entered the carrier's system, there was no way to accelerate it. They were at the mercy of the logistics network. Matt walked outside and looked across the road. Rick's operation was running at full capacity, 2 tractors planting simultaneously. Crews working into the evening under field lights. The progress was visible, measurable, and humiliating because everyone in the area knew both farms had started planting at the same time. And now one was nearly finished while the other was dead in the water waiting for a sensor that should have been available off the shelf. The word spread fast in farm communities. By May 14th, half the county knew Matt's Massey Ferguson was down and that Rick's John Deere had suffered the same failure and was back running the next day. The comparisons were inevitable. At the co-op, guys made comments. Nothing vicious, just pointed. One guy said that's the risk you take when you leave the green paint. Another said parts availability is half the equation. Doesn't matter how good the tractor is if you can't keep it running. A third just shook his head and said, I'd never run equipment that doesn't have dealer support within 20 miles. Matt didn't respond. He paid for his seed order and left, but the frustration was building, because the Massey Ferguson 8S265 was a better machine than Rick's John Deere 8R in almost every measurable category: fuel efficiency, transmission performance, cab ergonomics, power delivery. Matt had the data to prove it. But none of that mattered when the tractor was sitting in a field immobilized, and the parts network couldn't deliver a basic sensor in less than 2 weeks. On May 15th, the part arrived. Matt drove to Fremont, picked it up, and had it installed by early afternoon. The 8S265 fired up clean. No error codes, transmission engaged perfectly. The repair took 40 minutes. Total cost including labor was $410, and Matt had lost 11 days of productivity. He drove back to the field and resumed planting, but the damage was done. He was 520 acres behind schedule. Weather forecasts showed rain moving in by May 18th. He had 3 days to finish planting or risk delays that could push him into late May, which meant lower yield potential and increased weed pressure. He ran extended hours, pushed his operators to the limit, brought in contract help, and by May 17th, he'd closed the gap to 180 acres remaining. Then the rain came. Not a light shower, a legitimate system that dumped 2 inches over 36 hours and turned the remaining fields into mud. Planting stopped completely, and Matt sat in his shop watching the weather radar, while Rick's farm, fully planted 4 days earlier, sat protected under emerging soybean canopy. The final numbers told the story. Rick finished planting on May 13th. Total acreage, 1,800. Matt finished on May 22nd, 9 days later. The 180 acres he planted after the rain came in late and uneven. Germination rates were lower. Early growth was stunted. And by mid-June, it was clear those acres were going to underperform the rest of the field by 8 to 10 bushels per acre. That translated to roughly $14,000 in lost revenue, all because of a $340 sensor and an 11-day parts delay. Matt ran the analysis over and over. He calculated the fuel savings his Massey Ferguson delivered compared to Rick's John Deere. He accounted for the lower purchase price, the reduced maintenance costs, and even with all those advantages, the parts delay had wiped out 18 months of operational gains in a single planting season. He called the Massey Ferguson dealer and had a blunt conversation. He explained what had happened. He explained the financial impact. And he asked what the dealer was going to do to make sure this never happened again. The dealer was apologetic. He acknowledged the parts availability had been unacceptable. He said they were working with AGCO to improve regional inventory levels. He offered Matt a credit on his next service visit. But he also admitted that Massey Ferguson's parts distribution network wasn't as developed as John Deere's. It was a reality of market share. John Deere moved more volume, so they could justify stocking more parts at more locations. Massey Ferguson was still building that infrastructure. Matt appreciated the honesty, but honesty didn't plant soybeans, and it didn't recover lost yield. He thanked the dealer and hung up. Then he sat in his office and made a decision. If Massey Ferguson's parts network couldn't support his operation the way John Deere supported Rick's, then he'd build his own. He started with a detailed parts inventory analysis. He pulled service records for all 4 of his Massey Ferguson tractors and identified every component that had been replaced in the last 3 years. Sensors, filters, belts, hydraulic lines, electrical connectors, wear items. He cross-referenced the list with failure frequency data and created a tiered stocking strategy. Critical components that could immobilize a tractor got priority. He ordered backups for every high-risk part: transmission sensors, fuel system components, electronic control modules, hydraulic pumps. The initial investment was $22,000. It hurt. But Matt calculated that if it prevented even one major delay during a critical window, it would pay for itself. He set up a climate-controlled storage area in his shop, installed shelving, labeled everything, created a digital inventory system, and by early June, he had enough parts on hand to handle 90% of potential failures without relying on dealer stock. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Not the dealer, not his neighbors, not even Rick. But word got around anyway, because in July, when another Massey Ferguson operator 2 counties over experienced a similar parts delay, Matt got a phone call. The guy had heard through the regional network that Matt was stocking his own parts. He asked if Matt could help him out, loan him a sensor until the dealer shipment arrived. Matt said yes, drove over that afternoon, handed the guy the part, refused payment, just said pass it on when you can. By fall, Matt had helped 3 other Massey Ferguson operators avoid parts delays by loaning components from his inventory, and something unexpected started happening. The Massey Ferguson dealer in Fremont began calling Matt when customers needed urgent parts that weren't in stock. They'd check Matt's inventory first before ordering from the warehouse. Matt became an unofficial parts depot for the region. He didn't charge for it, didn't profit from it. He just saw it as a way to protect the Massey Ferguson community from the infrastructure gap that had cost him $14,000. Harvest came in September. Matt's yields were respectable. The late-planted acres underperformed as expected, but the rest of the crop came in strong. His Massey Ferguson Ideal 9T combine ran flawlessly. 0 breakdowns, 0 parts delays, and when he tallied the final numbers, his cost per acre was still lower than Rick's operation despite the planning setback. But the emotional damage lingered, because Matt knew that if parts availability had been equal, if the support infrastructure had been comparable, his Massey Ferguson operation would have outperformed Rick's John Deere farm in every metric: fuel costs, maintenance expenses, equipment reliability. The machines were better, the dealer relationship was strong, but the logistics network had failed him at the worst possible moment. And in agriculture, timing is everything. Matt and Rick had coffee in late October. It wasn't planned. They just ran into each other at the feed mill, and Rick suggested they grab a cup. They sat in the truck and talked about the season. Rick brought up the parts delay without Matt prompting it. He said, "I felt bad watching you sit there waiting for that sensor. I know how frustrating that must have been." Matt nodded and said it was a learning experience. Rick asked if Matt regretted switching to Massey Ferguson, and Matt thought about it for a long time before answering. He said no, the equipment is better, the performance proves it, but the support system isn't there yet. And until it is, guys like me have to build our own safety net. Rick respected that answer. He didn't argue, didn't gloat, just said, "I get it. Brand loyalty only matters if the brand can back it up. And right now, John Deere can. Massey Ferguson is getting there, but they're not there yet." Matt finished his coffee and got out of the truck. He shook Rick's hand and drove home. And that night, he placed another parts order. $8,000 worth of components, high-risk items, critical sensors, backup modules. He wasn't leaving his operation vulnerable again. If Massey Ferguson couldn't guarantee parts availability, he'd guarantee it himself. By spring 2026, Matt's personal parts inventory was worth $34,000. He'd helped 9 different Massey Ferguson operators avoid downtime by loaning or selling components at cost. The dealer in Fremont had started referring customers directly to Matt when urgent parts weren't available. And ATCO regional management had reached out asking if Matt would be willing to consult on improving their parts distribution strategy for rural markets. Matt agreed. He spent 2 days in meetings with ATCO logistics teams, walked them through his inventory system, showed them the failure data, explained how a single $340 sensor delay had cost him $14,000 and damaged the brand's reputation in his entire county. The AGCO reps took notes, asked good questions, and 6 months later the Fremont dealership expanded their parts inventory by 40%, prioritizing the exact components Matt had identified as high risk. But the damage to Massey Ferguson's reputation in eastern Nebraska was already done, because Rick's story about fixing his John Deere in 16 hours while Matt waited 11 days had spread across the region. And when farmers talked about equipment decisions, that story came up. Every time. It didn't matter that Matt's Massey Fergusons were more efficient, didn't matter that his operating costs were lower, didn't matter that his harvest performance was exceptional. What mattered was that when both tractors broke, one was back running the next day, and the other sat dead for nearly 2 weeks. 3 farmers in Matt's area who had been considering Massey Ferguson equipment decided to stick with John Deere. Not because the machines were better, but because they couldn't afford the risk of a parts delay during a critical window. The dealer in Fremont, estimated the story cost them $1.8 million in lost sales over 18 months. And while Matt never blamed himself for that, he understood the consequences. In agriculture, perception shapes decisions, and the perception was clear. Massey Ferguson built great tractors, but if you couldn't get parts when you needed them, the quality didn't matter. Matt kept running his Massey Ferguson fleet. The 8S.265 that had failed during planting logged another 1,100 hours without issue. His fuel savings continued to compound, his maintenance costs stayed low, and his personal parts inventory meant he never experienced another delay like May 2025. But he also accepted a hard truth. Owning the best equipment meant nothing if the infrastructure couldn't support it. And until Massey Ferguson closed that gap, operators like him would always be building their own safety nets and explaining to neighbors why they took the risk. Rick never switched brands. He stayed with John Deere, not because the tractors were better, but because when his equipment broke, he could walk into a dealership 20 minutes away and leave with the part he needed. That reliability was worth the higher fuel costs, worth the premium pricing, worth the brand loyalty tax. Because in farming, downtime doesn't just cost money, it costs yield, it costs respect, and it costs the confidence that when you make a decision, the support system will back it up. Matt understood that now. He'd learned it the hard way. 11 days in a field, watching his neighbor finish planting while a $340 sensor sat on a truck somewhere between Missouri and Nebraska. The Massey Ferguson 8S.265 was the best tractor he'd ever operated, but the parts delay had taught him something more valuable than fuel economy data. It taught him that performance without infrastructure is just potential, and potential doesn't plant soybeans. 2 years later, Matt still runs Massey Ferguson. His parts inventory is now valued at $48,000. He's helped 14 operators avoid critical delays. The Fremont dealership stocks twice as many components as they did in 2025, and AGCO has implemented several of Matt's recommendations across their Midwest distribution network. The infrastructure is improving, slowly but measurably. And across the road, Rick still runs John Deere, still gets parts the same day, still finishes planting on schedule. The two farms operate side by side, same soil, same weather, same acreage. One painted red, one painted green. And every spring, when the planters roll, both men think about May 2025. About the 11 days that proved equipment quality and support infrastructure aren't the same thing. And about the hard lesson that sometimes the better machine still loses because the system around it wasn't ready to win.